Well, we'll go ahead and get started. On to week 2, and this week we are walking through and talking about the book of Habakkuk. Now, the Habakkuk is often called the prophet of faith, but interestingly, does not follow the normal beings of a prophetic book. We'll start off with the structure, which you have in your workbook. Let me turn there. Habakkuk is typically split into 3 major parts. Obviously, we have the heading in 1:1 that clues us into the background information, the writer of the book, the purpose of the book. Act 2 is all of chapters 1 and chapter 2, where Habakkuk will engage in a conversation with God about the wickedness of his days and pleading with God in his weary tone to deal with it. And after he's satisfied with the answers in chapter 3, Habakkuk will then sing a hymn praise in praise of Yahweh and his great power and his great faithfulness to him. A little bit of a background information of the book. The Habakkuk, the writer's name means love embrace. Martin Luther gave a striking definition and calls Habakkuk signifies him as an embracer, or one who embraces another and takes it into his arms. And Habakkuk in this book often has a question mark for a brain, as written there. And that the time is probably written during the reign of Josiah. And remember, Habakkuk is a contemporary of Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Nahum. So it's happening along the same times as the destruction of Nineveh, which we know happens in 612 BC. And the destruction of Nineveh was 100 years after Nahum's prophesying. So now, when Nahum prophesied, this great power that's coming up to destroy Nineveh, the Babylonian Empire, is in full force, and they're sweeping across the lands. It has come true about Nineveh. They have been completely destroyed. Habakkuk appears in the twilight just before the darkness of the Babylonian captivity. The message of the book is kind of gloomy, but it does close in glory. Habakkuk's big question is, why God? Why would God permit evil? Why would God use an evil force to bring about his just means? And he's often called the prophet of faith. The great statement in Habakkuk 2:4, the just shall live by faith, has been quoted multiple times in the New Testament, and is a crux on which Paul stands his justification for salvation by faith through grace. So, he's an interesting one because it does not begin with the typical pronouncement of judgment on a nation for their wickedness, but instead Habakkuk, this weary prophet, sees the wickedness of his day from his people in Judah and calls upon the Lord to bring judgment. So, the heading of the book reveals in 1:1 a pronouncement that God revealed to Habakkuk the prophet. See, there's a quote from Ronald Blue. It's a unique book, unlike other prophets who declared God's message to his people. This prophet dialogued with God about his people. Most Old Testament prophets proclaimed divine judgment. Instead, Habakkuk pleaded for divine judgment. In contrast with the typical indictment, this little book records an intriguing interchange between the perplexed prophet and his maker. So Habakkuk's big question his first question in chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, I'll read it. Let me get to my spot. He says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflicts abound. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in righteousness so that justice is perverted." Habakkuk's prophets, this cry of complaint, right, sounds forth hauntingly. The prophet is weary with the world that it is. His first question is characterized as a complaint. Right? He is fed up with the wickedness prospering and the righteous suffering. How could God allow such things? He was fed up with the answers that came from men, and so he wanted an answer directly that came from God. Habakkuk's big complaint during this time was directed at the people of Judah, and that there is no law and order. There is no justice. There is no righteousness. Instead, there is conflict, there is injustice, and there is violence because of the wickedness that is continuing to bubble up in Judah. This is not what the people of God should be or what they should be viewed as. So Habakkuk is wondering, Lord, how long will you allow this to continue? His primary complaint is that Judah has abandoned her righteousness intended by God, and the society has degraded into lawlessness, violence, and injustice. But Habakkuk knew that God was a God of righteousness, that he was slow to anger, and that he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Although he has specifics about what he's asking, his main point is how long, Lord, will you let these wicked people continue? Picking up in verse 5, the Lord answers Habakkuk. He says, first off, it's stop and look. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your day that you would not believe, even if you were told. For I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. Now, the prophet had hoped for a response to this lament that would be an oracle of salvation coming, but instead he receives an oracle of judgment. So Yahweh starts off his answer to Habakkuk first off to stop and look, right? Kind of like how when, let's say my kids are starving and they run into the kitchen while I'm cooking dinner and they say, when's dinner? The first thing I say, well, what am I doing? Like, stop and look at what I'm doing. Am I cooking dinner, right? Those snacks that they ate 30 minutes ago have worn off and now they're absolutely just starving to death. So we just stop, look, what am I doing, right? Habakkuk was so narrowly focused on the wickedness of Judah, he didn't realize the big picture. He hadn't seen God working upstream. Although he does immediately receive an answer from God, although it doesn't directly answer the prophet's questions about his specific concerns, but the basic thrust of the prophet's complaint is, what are you going to do about this? And the Lord responds in a way that both amazed and frightened the prophet. He responds with first, stop and look. And it's no answer of salvation at all, but an announcement that God is bringing up a powerful and mighty army to action. So remember, this is about 100 years after Nahum prophesies the destruction of Nineveh. That same Babylonian army that we learned about when we talked about Nahum, the ruthlessness, the barbaric nature of that army, is the one that is coming. And that's not a good thing. So we already have a good understanding to understand the ruthlessness of this army, and God details their greatness or their powerful nature in the second section when he not only says, okay, stop and look, see what's happening around the other nations, but let me describe to you this army. He says in verse 7, they are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, and their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building up earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So in this description, it reveals one of Habakkuk's great theological themes, that true evil has seeds of self-destruction within it. This army is great and powerful, but they will not have the last word, even as even this army has self-destructive traits such as greed, arrogance, self-sufficiency, haughtiness, and blasphemy. God will allow tyrants often to flourish and spring up for a short while, but they will typically come destroyed by their own abuse of their power, right? And like a plant firmly rooted, God will blow them over and they will wither away. See, that's God's point in verse 11. Even though they are powerful in nature, they are only temporary and eventually be destroyed, if not by God themselves. Habakkuk's big worry was this Babylonian army that had been sweeping through the nations with their wickedness had been going on for a long period of time. And so Habakkuk is wondering, why have you allowed this, God? At what point will you step in to rectify this? But he's basing that off his own understanding of time, not God's understanding of time and how God acts to work within the world. Habakkuk may see this happening for generations and generations, but in God's eye, this is only a short while. So, moving on, in verse 12, Habakkuk then questions God about the Babylonians. Habakkuk's second complaint seeks an answer to explain the first one. Like we said, how could God use the Babylonians as a wicked and unclean instrument to carry out this purpose to punish the wicked in Judah. Can a holy and just God do such a thing? It says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, will you never die? You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoings. Why then do you tolerate the treacherousness? Why are you still silent while the wicked swallow up those that are more righteous with themselves? Because Habakkuk knew so much about God, he illustrates that in his knowledge in verses 12 through 13, that he appeared concerned about God's work among the other nation. His argument is that, God, if you are these things in verse 12, how can you allow these things in verse 13? What I find funny is that at the end of verse 13, Habakkuk had just finished complaining about the wrongdoings and the wickedness that has come up with his people of Judah, but all of a sudden, when God brings up the Babylonians, who are far more wicked, all of a sudden, the people in Judah are righteous, all of a sudden. Well, in Habakkuk's eyes, the wrongdoings of the people of Judah compared to the wrongdoings of the Babylonians, yes, you could consider Judah righteous, because what they had been guilty of is far and away less than what the Babylonians have been guilty of. Now, this does not fit Habakkuk's understanding of who God is, that a holy God can allow an unrighteous entity to continue in evil, wicked ways. But he knew that God could not allow wrongdoings, and he doesn't tolerate that, and that God will use the Babylonian army in order to accomplish his sovereign purpose. So he's confused. How can God allow this unrighteous to continue? But also, how is he going to use this to accomplish his sovereign purpose? Right? Habakkuk was confused. Now, like I said, Judah had not been acting righteous at this point, but compared to the Babylonians, they kind of were living as a righteous nation. So he continues and says, you have made people like the fish in the sea. And that's not it. In verse 15, the wicked foe pulls up all of them with hooks. He catches them with his nets. He gathers them in his dragnet, and so rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burnt incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choice food. Is he to keep on emptying his nets, destroying the nations without mercy? Interestingly, Habakkuk will further explain to God the problem with the Babylonians, as if God does not already understand that. Habakkuk is so confused and bewildered by this revelation that he defaults to making sure that God knows who these Babylonians are. He first reminds God that the order in which creation was made under him, right? You made the fish in the sea, the creatures that have no rulers. And then he compares those creatures of the sea and the Babylonians to fishermen. The point being that the people are helpless and directionless, and the fishermen take advantage of those helpless fish. Now, can God allow this, even though he's the one that created them? From there, that is not the right slide. There we go. From there, he describes Babylonians as fishermen who take advantage of the situation through their strength and through their instrumentation. The Babylonians worship themselves, and they live in excess. This has been going on for so long that Habakkuk finishes this by questioning if God will even allow this to continue. In this context, Habakkuk's complaint takes on a more profound meaning. How can God, a holy, pure, and immoral God, remain silent in the face of this wickedness? He didn't remain silent in the face of Nineveh and Assyria's wickedness and destroyed them, but it was 100 years after Nahum prophesied. So God is slow to anger and will allow for a certain time to wickedness to continue. And how can God use the Babylonians as this instrument of wrath? And then how long will they continue to empty their nets and continue to do these wicked things that they have been doing for so long? We know God's character from Nahum, that God will allow these wrongdoings for a period of time, and Habakkuk understands that too. But what the Babylonians have done, is that not enough for you to act yet, God? When does it become enough? When are their nets full enough? When will you even allow them? At what point do their wrongdoings become enough for you to act? Habakkuk is asking at this point for knowledge that really is not his. You can sense his frustration and his bewilderment. So Yahweh will answer him about the Babylonians. This answer begins with a in verse 1 to 3, an introduction that provides instructions for our prophet. God says, I will stand at my watch, in verse 1, chapter 2, and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see and what he says to me, and what I am to give this complaint. Then the Lord replied, write down this revelation, and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits at appointed time. It speaks of the end, and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it, and it will certainly come, and will not delay. The introduction to God's answer about the wickedness of the Babylonians in verse 1-3 provides just that, an introduction and an instruction for Habakkuk to write these things down. And from there, God will then indict the Babylonians through a series of 5 woes. But he starts off in verse 4, see, the enemy is puffed up, his desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never rests, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes the captive of all the people. Right? There are 5 things going on here that he indicts Babylon for. They are drunkards, they are not righteous, they are arrogant, greedy, and that they are selfish. His message is short but direct, that the one who is puffed up in pride, whether through wealth, intellectual achievement, or physical strength, will die in their arrogance. It's self-destructive. But in contrast, the one who lives by faithfulness will live. This is applicable not only to the Babylonians, but also to those living in Judah. And verse 4 in chapter 2, or 4c, is quoted 3 different times in the New Testament, in Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:38. And what's interesting is Paul uses that idea as the righteous will live by faith as the cornerstone to his teachings of salvation, that salvation is by grace alone through faith in Jesus Christ. God is declaring an observation that the Lord has relationship to his people. And in any relationship, there's responsibilities on both parties to maintain that relationship. The responsibility for us as God's people is to maintain the relationship by living in faithfulness. And that can be difficult, especially in the face of things that we are uncertain of. In contrast to those who live by faith are those who live in pride and arrogance. From here until chapter 2, the Lord will continue to answer Habakkuk's second question about why God in a series of 5 woes. So let's walk through those. In your workbook, you should have this little chart here thing. Each of Habakkuk's woes begins with an invective built upon a threat and then a criticism from that from what they're doing. Except for the last section, each of them begins with a woe. And this series of woe confirms the truth that the Lord's message to Habakkuk, that the arrogant will ultimately fall under the weight of their own sin and righteousness, and those who live by faith in God will continue to live. It's important to understand that although these 5 woes are directed at the Babylonians and what they're doing, it's applicable to anybody. Anybody who is guilty of these 5 woes that he's going to point out will become self-destructive because there's self-destructive tendencies in these, and they will be destroyed. So yes, this is directed at the Babylonians and that what they're doing currently, but this also has applications for our lives and the lives of Judah and Habakkuk, who he was directly speaking to. He begins first with his first woe in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 3. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey, because you have plundered many nations. The people who are left will plunder you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. It first begins a woe to the plunderer, that person who builds their wealth, their monetary wealth, through extortion of the other nations. Remember, Assyria was guilty of this. We learned that last week. They built their wealth on the extortions of others and their mighty army presence. So too is Babylon guilty of the same thing. He begins with the threat then. They will be destroyed by those who are their creditors. They will arise, they will provoke a powerful force, and they will come after you. And this is self-destructive. Because you have done this, the spoilings of the nations. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. You reap what you sow. Just like the Assyrian army was destroyed in the same way they destroyed others by the Babylonians, so too what you do to others will come around to destroy you. This is a major theme throughout these 5 woes. He begins with his second woe. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gains. Again, building off the monetary gains of stolen wealth by extortion. You use that wealth to build this mighty house. You set yourself on nests on high, away from others, to escape the clutches of ruins. You have plotted the ruins of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the walls will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. His invective in verse 9 is a woe to the plotter, the person who uses that unjust gains to build a mighty house. The threat of that is that the stones will cry out and the beams of the woodwork will echo. Inanimate objects and the cosmos were sometimes called upon by God to witness the rebellions of human beings and aid in their destructions. And this is what Babylonians were guilty of, not just obtaining material wealth through unjust means, whether military power or extortion, but they took that gain and set themselves high above others. In their arrogance, the Babylonians felt themselves to be untouchable by ruin or judgment. But what God is saying, the very wood and the very stone that you build your house upon will be the judgment that comes down on you because you scheme against the other people, right? What you sow is what you will reap. What you have done to others will come back and will be done to you. Verse 10 illustrates the ultimate criticism of their actions, that they have traded their own lives and their own futures for this material gain. The third woe is in verse 12 through 14. Woe to him who builds a city on bloodshed, continuing to build on that principle of extortion and unjust gain, and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The third invective is the woe to the pillager, right? Who establishes a civilization through military power. You think back to Nineveh that we talked about last week. They built their civilization on their military power and the extortion of the smaller nations to gain wealth and power. This third woe builds on the first two and continues the idea of people gaining wealth by unlawful and unethical means. The Babylonians had built their civilization on the weak and the powerless, which ultimately collapsed under the weight of their oppression. God does not stand for this in accordance to Numbers 35:33, that states that a land built on bloodshed could not be purified through sacrifice, but only by the blood of the murderer. Right? That idea that, therefore, a city built on this type of blood, this type of bloodshed, must be rectified with the death of the oppressor. They will be destroyed in verse 13. Right? The nations will rise up against them, and this will be confirmed. And surety, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. God knows this to happen. In the same way they destroyed other nations, they too will be destroyed. Habakkuk's point in verse 13 is that their work is futile, only for the flames of history to be forgotten. Their civilization will eventually be torn down, and their labor will eventually lead to nothing. The criticism of their society is grounded in the surety of the knowledge of God, that God will make himself known to the other nations and punish all that participate in these practices. In the same way that God punished the Assyrians through the Babylonians for their barbaric practices, God too will punish the Babylonians eventually in time. The fourth woe begins in verse 15 and says, Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pouring it out from their wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with the shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. This fourth woe in this section focuses on the perverter, those who are drunk and violent. Babylon's sins often involve using liquors for the purpose of manipulating other people, on actually a device still widely practiced today. The Old Testament in Daniel 5 often pictured the Babylonians as a nation known for its drinking parties that often turn into wild orgies. The nations with Babylon conquered often forced them to drink from their cup of wrath and anger of not alcohol, and thus brought shame and disgrace on the other nations. For Habakkuk, this analogy symbolized Babylonians' relationship with the other nations. Babylon took advantage of the other nations and shamed them that they conquered. And that's what he's talking about here. You will be disgraced in that. In verse 16 is important in light of what we learn about God's punishment on Nineveh. In the same way Nineveh was shamed and had their nakedness exposed by the Babylonians, so too will God expose the Babylonians' nakedness and shame them. In the same way that Nineveh was brought to international shame, so too will Babylon be brought to international shame. That Nineveh will be remembered as a shell of her former self, so too will Babylon be remembered as a shell of her former self. See, Babylon had done there's an interesting note about Lebanon in verse 17. Babylon had done violence to Lebanon, as God directly picks out there. They had destroyed the forests that surrounded the nation and deprived the animals of their natural habitat. Babylon had destroyed an important area to all the surrounding nations, and just as they had stripped Babylon or Lebanon and made them naked, so too will God strip Babylon and expose their shame. And again, this all happens. There are self-destructive tendencies in all of these woes and everything that Babylon is guilty of. So in reality, yes, this will come to pass, but in reality, this will be by their own fault. What Habakkuk, or what God is pointing out here, is that all of these characteristics of these wicked people have self-destructive tendencies. So God really doesn't have to act yet. They will destroy themselves from within. The final and fifth woe comes in verse 18 through 20 and focuses on the polytheist. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. And woe to him who says to the wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silenced to you. The woe against the polytheists. The final woe focuses on the maker of idols and begins with a criticism of the idol maker. Their reliance and their pride is in their own creation. The woe is given in verse 19. Who says to the wood, to this foolish person who thinks that wood or gold and silver can provide anything other than threat and destruction. And finally, the criticism that comes in verse 20 is focusing on the Lord, that the Lord is the only one. The supremacy of God is the only thing that can last through the ages, not these idols that make. We pick up in chapter 3. God has finished indictment of the Babylonians to this set of 5 woes. He has pointed out all the self-destructive characteristics that they are guilty of, and how eventually, time and time again, whether they are guilty of one of them or whether they are guilty of 5 of them, each one is enough to bring ruin and self-destruction to themselves. But they are guilty of all 5. And remember, even though these are directed at the Babylonians, these are applicable to any person who struggles with arrogance, greed, selfishness, idolatry. Any of these things will eventually have self-destructive tendencies and lead to destruction. So Habakkuk, hearing that, offers a hymn in praise to Yahweh. Dr. Constable says, having received the revelation that Yahweh would destroy Babylon, Habakkuk could understand that he was just in using the wicked nation to discipline Israel. Babylon would not go free, but would perish for her sins. This insight led Habakkuk to write the prayer of praise that concludes this book. He starts off in verse 1, chapter 3, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. This prayer describes the greatness of God in the past and expresses the prophet's confidence of the Lord in the future. Habakkuk understands that what God has done in the past is a model and promise of what God will do in the future. And being aware of what God has done in the past, he offers a prayer in remembrance of that to God, hoping or in the knowledge of God will act in the same way that he has acted in the past. And the opening verses are a petition for God to do that. He says, remember the deeds, O Lord, probably referring to the exodus out of Egypt, the main event of Israel's history. From there, he will break down his prayer into a few parts. The first one begins in chapter 3, verse 3 to 7, where he illustrates the awesomeness of God's appearance. He says, God came down from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hands, where his power was hidden. Plagues went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed. But he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. The prophet recalls God's work in the past and calls upon God to renew that work and to make his deeds known. The vision of God that Habakkuk describes in the first 5 verses show a theophany, which is a physical manifestation of God, his appearance in both power and glory, and often looks to the event of the Exodus. This looks to the events of the Exodus and the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Habakkuk is praising these attributes of God, which inspired the praises of men found other places in the Old Testament. The main point of this section is that Habakkuk wishes the main point Habakkuk wishes to make is picturing God as triumphant in these triumphant ways in which he has acted in the past, and how God will emulate those actions for his people in the coming future. Moving on from that, in the next 7 verses, Habakkuk illustrates Yahweh's angry actions. He says, were you angry at the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the seas when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. And the mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of waters swept by. The deep roared and lifted up its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows and lightning of your flashing spears. From start to finish, Israel's God has been shown to be the victor over all individuals, all creation, and all nations, and champions of those who followed in his train. Habakkuk continues to affirm the Lord's symbolic work in the midst of the storm, right? The connection to waters, storms, rivers, streams, seas really shows God's power over the chaotic element of water. Remember, in the beginning of Genesis, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless, void, and darkness was over the depths of the sea. In Jewish tradition, those are the 4 chaotic elements that Israel feared most: formless, voidlessness, darkness, and water. God, or Habakkuk, is saying that just like in Nahum, when he illustrated God has power over the water, so too is Habakkuk illustrating that God has power over one of the most creative but also destructive elemental powers of our world, right? And this, you have to understand, for those of you who own a home, you know that water is the biggest enemy of a house. It can destroy, the little smallest leak over time can absolutely destroy anything. But what Habakkuk is saying is, not only does God have power over the small waters, he has power over these large bodies of water that have the ability in a torrential downpour to change the landscape, because in the mountainous region, large amounts of water wreaked havoc on the countryside. God is the controller over heaven and earth and all of the elements that abide in them. Now in verse 12, the author moves from God's power over the natural world to God's power over the inhabitants of that world. He says, in wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. That's the crucial act we have to keep in mind. You came out to deliver your people. To save your anointed one. You crushed the leaders of the land of the wicked, and you stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head. When his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour, the wretched who were in hiding, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. In parallelism with God moving across the earth in anger and wrath, so too does our prophet describe God moving over the wicked inhabitants of earth in anger and wrath. He uses this illustration of threshing, which was a common agricultural practice that involved the use of an ox and large stones to crush wheat or barley in order to separate the ears of grain from the stalk, right? In the same way that threshing separates the grain from the stalk, so too will God thresh the nations and separate the righteous from the wicked. Moving on towards the end, as we're getting ready to finish out, Habakkuk finishes with, he's already illustrated God's power. He's already illustrated God's wrath and anger and control over not only the elements of the world, but also the inhabitants of that world. And he finishes with his commitment of faith to Yahweh. Picks up in verse 16. I have heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the days of calamity to come on the nations invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop falls or fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joy in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He will make my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. Before any calamity or judgment comes, our prophet displays his own observation. That was pointed out in verse 2:4, that the righteous will live by faith. For at the end of the book, Habakkuk waits patiently for the day of calamity to come and to the nations invading us. That has not yet arrived. Basically, Habakkuk represents the reader here. Judgment has begun, and the followers of Yahweh must wait to see the results of God's wrath. Habakkuk's expression of faith here is profound. He waits patiently for the day of calamity, knowing that what God has done in the past is a model and promise of what God will do in the future. What he illustrates through verses 16 and 17 is what nobody wanted, right? Especially in verse 17. The fig tree does not bud, there are no grapes on the vine, the olive crop fails, and the field produces no food. Their agricultural means of sustainability are dead. Though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, everything is going to ruins. There's no crops, there's no animals, things are going bad, but in the midst of all of that, Habakkuk will remain faithful. People often wonder why God continues to allow evil to come up in the world, and it's a question that all of us really struggle with. I have three reasons for this, and they're back in my seminary days. My professor, Dr. James Allman, these comes directly from him, but it satisfies me enough, right? So why does God allow evil to continue in the world? We think that God allows evil to continue in the world for three reasons. The first one is to give sinners enough rope to hang themselves with, for them to continue in their evil so that on the day of judgment, they're without excuse, right? The second reason why could be that God allows evil to continue in this world in order to give sinners a chance to repent. Those caught up in unrighteousness and wickedness deserve the patience of God in order to repent and come to know Him. I mean, all of us were given immense patience by the Lord in order to repent and come to know Him. So too does God extend that to others. And the third reason why I think God continues to allow evil in this world can be the more difficult one to grasp, and it's that God allows wicked things to happen so that God's people can learn to trust Him even though He looks untrustable. Especially in the days of Habakkuk, when God revealed that there's this large, barbaric, gruesome, terrible, horrible army coming towards them, right? And that when all hopes looks lost, that hopefully God's people will learn to trust Him, even though in the midst of all of it, God looks untrustable. I think that's a big one. We'll close with a reflection from Dr. Constable. Habakkuk trembled all over as he waited for the day of Babylon's invasion of Judah, the day of her distress. He could do nothing but wait patiently for the Babylons to grow stronger and for judgment to come on Israel. It is a terrible feeling to know that calamity is coming and that one can do nothing to prevent it except to trust in the Lord. The concluding notation of Habakkuk in 13:9a says, for the director of music on my stringed instruments. What does the term Selah or Selah mean? It's a Hebrew term that sometimes goes untranslated. I actually knew a girl back at Dallas Christian College. Her name was Selah. I have a note here that simply says, the term Selah is primarily used in the Psalms, and it's used multiple times throughout Habakkuk, and is thought to be a musical or liturgical marker. Its exact meaning is debated, but it is often interpreted as a pause for reflection, either a musical interlude, or an instruction to lift up voice or instruments. It serves as a moment for the reader or listener to contemplate the preceding message. So in contemplating the preceding message, the destruction is imminent, Babylon is coming to power, and there is absolutely nothing that Israel can do to stop that. The only thing they can do is continue to live by faith and to trust in the Lord even in times when he looks untrustable. Thank you. That concludes today. We will come back next week for the book of Zephaniah and seeing that the day of the Lord is coming near. All right. Thank you all.